All right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and kick off this morning. Good morning, good Friday, good weekend. And this is the first Movement Summit series installment in 2021. We're calling this Voting Rights Threat Assessment. Where do we go from here? I'm Charles Ellison. I'm normally host, executive producer of Reality Check, a daily public affairs program on WURD radio based in Philadelphia. It's the home of Black Talk Media. More at wordradio.com for that. But I'm also senior fellow of the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. I'm also the continued host, moderator of this ongoing program, this ongoing series, the Micro Summit series. You remember that from 2020. And so for more information on the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, go to CSG-ERC.org for more information there. Welcome everyone. We're going to start our panel very shortly, momentarily. One of our panelists is running a little bit behind. I'm going to introduce them in a moment. Later on, probably halfway through this discussion, we're going to open it up for any comments or questions that you all from the audience have. You can leave those in the Zoom group chat, which is off to your right side. And I'll make sure to relay those questions or provide those to our panelists who are here today. As I said, this is a production of CSG Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. We're also doing this in conjunction with our partners, All Voting is Local, and also WURD Radio and the B Note. For more information, go to thebenote.com, of which I am publisher. Let's introduce our panelists and get our discussion going right away. You do see on the panel, they're kind of up at the top here. Scott Seaborg is Pennsylvania Director of All Voting is Local. For more information, go to allvotingislocal.org. Also, Anoa Shanga is a renowned electoral justice reporter, journalist, also lawyer. She is based in Atlanta. She has written for, continues to write for a number of prominent publications, Scalawag, also Essence, Prism, and a number of others. And I know I'm leaving out. You can go to @theway_with_Anoa for more information on her. Also, Representative Chris Rabb, also joining us, state representative from Pennsylvania, representing parts of the Philadelphia area, the 200th legislative district. He's at Rep Rab on Twitter, on social media, if you'd like to also keep track of what he's doing as well. How are you all doing? We also have Representative B. Nguyen, who is a state representative out of Georgia. She will be joining us later on, probably around the 10:30 mark, as she's in a meeting right now. But she will be joining us momentarily and being a part of this panel as well. And we're going to be getting some perspective from primarily folks in Pennsylvania and Georgia about this nationwide threat to voting rights and how that's going to play out, how we anticipate that playing out, particularly as we head into new election cycles. I'll start with you, Anoa, and deepest condolences and prayers to you and the community down there in Atlanta for the horror that happened earlier this week. I know it's been a rough go for everyone down there, so I hope everyone is doing well. I know we were talking about it before you came on, but just want to extend condolences and prayers to everyone down there. But in the face of all that, you're also dealing with these assaults on voting rights. Kind of give us a framework or an outline of how severe that looks right now, or what you're very concerned and worried about as things play out in the Georgia State Legislature.
Yeah, appreciate the question, appreciate the opening condolences. Not that I am the representative to accept that for anyone, but I do want to say, you know, the horrible, atrocious series of killings that we saw happen 3 days ago now, is a direct part of the same culture of othering and dehumanizing people that we have seen increasing and intensifying over the past few years in particular. That is also a part of the undercurrent that we see attached to attacking other rights, including what we're seeing right now around voting rights. A lot of these things are connected. So here in the state of Georgia, the same, you know, investment that is placed in taking away, you know, the ability to use no excuse absentee ballots. So that's just being able to vote by mail and get an absentee ballot for any reason, because that's how you choose to vote, or being able to vote on a Sunday, souls to the polls, something that's very popular, particularly with, you know, Black churches. So, you know, those measures, but also being able to support rights and protections for folks who are not English native speakers in places, right? So there are so many different layers, let alone some of the other issues that we're seeing coming out, where the fact that it's so much easier, this gunman, is able to get a gun much easier than it will be for many of us to cast our ballot if the Republican-led legislature has its way. And that's not even a partisan statement. Identifying a party doing something is not necessarily partisanship itself. It's recognizing that there are particular obstacles to life, liberty, justice, and democracy that are happening here under the Gold Dome. And in particular, with these bills, we are seeing a huge backlash, totally grounded in the big lie told by former President Donald Trump, in the aftermath of not only the November general election, but we saw it come all the way through to the January special election and runoff election, not special. It felt special as Georgia tipped the balance of power in the Senate, sending 2 U.S. senators, the first Black senator from the state of Georgia, Reverend Raphael Warnock, to the Senate, and John Ossoff, who is one of the younger senators, right? So it is really just an amazing time, in the sense that there's so much energy and focus. I don't know if folks have actually taken a break since the elections, because we knew this was coming. I mean, Republicans were announcing that they were going to attack voting rights in the middle of the pandemic, and we saw it happening not just here in Georgia, but in multiple states, where at the same time where we had provisions being lifted or steps taken because of the public health crisis that has been caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, we simultaneously saw or heard statements being said by prominent leaders, particularly here, the head of the Georgia House, David Ralston, in June was giving interviews 2020, talking about how Republicans would never be able to win anywhere again if vote by mail was something that was going to continue. So we have seen this tension and battle happening here, and whether it's requiring people to have to use a voter ID when they're applying for an absentee ballot and when they're casting their absentee ballot, these are all multiple issues that are really impacting. And that's a burden, because so many people do not have access to a printer or a scanner to even be able to submit a copy of their ID alongside. This was a similar challenge we saw people raising around, the need for postage in many ways, and during the pandemic as well. So these are just some of the things. I mean, limiting early voting hours, curtailing the use of absentee ballot drop-off boxes. They're calling these, they're 2 major bills that are just basically consolidated massive repressive changes to voting laws that are really going to shrink and not just impact, voters of color, but certainly some of these will have a blowback on, the Republican base here in Georgia as well.
Scott, and thank you for that overview, Noah. Scott, talk about Pennsylvania, and one of the reasons we have both Pennsylvania and Georgia, these are, among the top states with the highest rate of these types of legislation or these types of proposed policies. Talk about the situation in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has, I think, about the second highest rate of bills, or highest number of bills that are classified as voter suppression bills. Talk about what's happening there, or what's unfolding in the state legislature, or what is worrying and concerning you right now, because you all haven't been able to sleep since last year's election cycle.
No, absolutely. And Charles, thanks so much for having me here. I'll additionally put my condolences out to everyone in Georgia, and Noah yourself. Absolutely horrific, and definitely agreed that this is part and parcel of the big lie and these culture wars that are sort of putting violence out into our culture, and it's now coming home to roost. I think, to put Pennsylvania kind of on the table, it requires a little bit of narrative context. In 2019, Republicans and Democrats came together to pass the largest and pretty much only major election reform in the last 80 years or so in Pennsylvania. And one of the big pieces that they introduced to the electorate was no excuse absentee balloting, as well as this idea that you can sort of cast a ballot before election day in person with the early vote. And the pandemic sort of swept through the nation. Counties, really did a heroic job making sure to process over 20-fold increase in vote by mail ballots in Pennsylvania, because we went sort of from nothing to everything. And, there was millions and millions of these ballots cast. And it sort of showed that people like balloting by mail. They like the convenience. They like the idea that they're not putting their health at risk in order to participate in their democracy. And what we saw during, I think, the 2020 elections and immediately afterwards was a lot of consternation from, folks in the legislature that a lot of people were going to be voting. So many people were voting, and they began to make rumblings about how, well, actually, the law that was a bipartisan effort is actually not constitutional. We're going to go back and try to take that away. They're trying to say that efforts made by the governor and the duly elected Supreme Court were in some way partisan or not constitutional. And I think really, most of us, no matter our color, origin, gender, want America to be a place where freedom is for everyone. And we have equal access and say and trust in the integrity of our elections. But what's happening in Pennsylvania, when all voters should have the freedom to vote equally, a handful of politicians are looking to put up barriers to silence our voices. And that's what it's really about, right? These folks are not into more people voting. In fact, as we saw, the most ballots cast in any presidential election ever, if I'm not mistaken. And somehow that leads them to think, well, we need to restrict access to this ballot. We need to make sure that it's harder for people to vote. And the only reason you would want to do something like that is to maintain power with less votes. And so I find this effort that Pennsylvania anti-voters, as I'll call them, has started going down the path with is absolutely just cynical. It's absolutely a thing to silence voters. And we know, as all voting is local, that together we can ensure every eligible American has the freedom to vote, and that the results of our elections reflect the will of the people, right? And so, instead of sort of talking about how negative and how harmful all of these policies are, I think it's also really important to look forward and talk about what do we expect from our elections in America? What do we expect from Pennsylvania? And how does that comport with the values of these anti-voter politicians seeking to tear down our options to vote?
And I just, at the start of this discussion, I just want to get an overview, kind of get each of your perspectives from these two key states, two battlegrounds as well, too, when it came down to it, pivotal battlegrounds as far as the presidential race and also the outcome in the U.S. Senate in 2020. And Representative Rabb, we have a situation, you're on that front line in a major legislature, but we have this happening in 43, 44 different states, 250 plus various pieces of legislation or bills looking to suppress the vote on some scale or some level. Proponents of those bills, however, will say, hey, this is us creating a layer of election security. There are also others making claims that there were improprieties during the 2020 election. So what's the response like to that as you've been in the legislature, looking at, well, one, hey, this is really voter suppression that's taking place here, but also trying to explain that, no, there weren't any improprieties or evidence of improprieties that took place in 2020. And
well, there were by
trying
Republicans.
to balance that conversation. Go ahead.
There were examples of Republican voters committing voter fraud. So just.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. How do you, yeah, okay, so there's one. So, but what's that battle like for you on that front line in the Pennsylvania legislature?
Gosh, where to begin? And I'm trying not to be profane, which is my general nature when I'm impassioned about issues around justice. So I will do my best to comport myself with a level of dignity and repose. So I am not only a state representative in the largest full-time state legislature in the country, with the 11th largest population of all the states. I also represent the most civically engaged legislative district of all 203. So I have the highest proportion of my constituents who actually vote. And I'm also in a state that is in the top 3 most gerrymandered states in the country. And that gerrymandering has created districts that are not reflective of our Commonwealth. And so, irrespective of what election laws we work on, garbage in, garbage out. So you get to vote in a highly gerrymandered district. That's deeply problematic. You do not have the same rights if you're not part of a major party. If you're independent, et cetera, you do not have the same rights, truly. And so if I were to remove my Democratic label and ran and had the capacity to run in a nonpartisan election, I would run the same way with the same values. So part of the problem, and one of the things we don't talk about, is that invisible layer of the duopoly that corrupts our participatory democracy, right? Because most people, most voters do not identify as Democrats or Republicans. I mean, most Americans anyway, of voting age. We are increasingly a minority because people are upset at both parties for different reasons and for similar reasons. And part of the reason that we can cast blame on both parties is because of entrenched incumbency. So when we're talking about who's in charge and, oh, the Republicans are putting up all these awful voter suppression bills. Yes, they are, but they didn't invent it. And Democrats have their own warts. And while this is technically not a partisan issue, it does talk about the very nature of a duopoly, which does not exist in most other industrialized nations. And that's a good thing, right? That that other nations have greater expanse in terms of how people are represented. But going to the deeper issue of voter suppression, this goes back to, you referenced it earlier, it's deeply connected with domestic terrorism. Because in Pennsylvania, we had to abolish the poll tax in 1933. In 1838, this state that started gradual abolition in 1780 decided 58 years later that free Black men should be stripped of their right to vote. We have an ugly history that transcends political party. It has more to do with white supremacy and domestic terrorism, because what it took for a Black person to vote, north or south or west, was potentially life-threatening. Oh, goodness gracious. Hello, can you hear me?
You're okay? Can we hear you?
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Representative.
Okay, I don't, something happened with the video, but I just want to say that if it is if it's a life-threatening situation for someone to exercise their right to vote, whether it's in the Deep South or it's in Philadelphia in 1871, then we are still addressing that legacy. It is connected. The voter suppression laws and proposed legislation today has a strong genealogy to the white supremacist laws that were on the books all across the country in various states. And these things, it comes down to state law.
Yeah, yeah. I know what, going back to you as part, thank you for that too, Representative, because I think those history lessons are very important. A lot of people not aware of the history of the right to vote and what that struggle was like. And so, I mean, we all could use the history lesson or a refresh on it or a civics course. That's always essential. I know what, so, let's talk about like where we kind of go from here, right? Because I think that's the big key question. There is an expectation that, especially in your state, Georgia, that many, if not all of these laws or proposed laws will pass. And they will influence the way people access the voting franchise in upcoming election cycles. Like, so I get the big question here is like, how do we adapt to that?
Yeah, so I think there are multiple things happening, right? Because I think as, we just got sent to church and school at the same time, these things have been in existence, right? Just especially not being from the South, but coming, I think, of age as an organizer here, right? It is a fascinating to really process some of that history, understanding and the struggle, and then just really look back. So we talk about the past couple of years here in Georgia, particularly with the race that Stacey Abrams ran 2017, 2018. But when you go back, to 10, 15, 20, 50 years, when you go back and see just the lineage, of that work that has already been happening around me, there's always been obstacles, people have been facing. So I think that's part of what people, are kind of feeling like we've always been organizing against the grain, so to speak. But at the same time, folks aren't giving up fighting because they have the corporate responsibility campaign, as corporate accountability campaign that's happening right now, putting pressure on major U.S. corporations based here in Georgia that have given donations to several other Republicans that have either introduced bills or are part of the sedition caucus or in some other way have had just really offensive policies, or just are just a part of the voter suppression support group, right? Like, so, that is something that's ongoing with organizing happening around Coca-Cola, Home Depot. I think Salesforce was the first, and I'm not sure if it's still the only company based here that has come out with a very strong statement against the bills, like expressly, saying they're not in favor of the bills at all. We've had some mealy-mouthed responses from the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. So, it's just an interesting watching people use multiple tactics right now to really push. But I think that the organizing that it has existed will just adapt the way it always has. And when you're asking, like, how do we adapt? Part of having the infrastructure in place, part of having the work of organizations like, so many of the folks that we have here in Georgia that do that year round. We've talked about this before, about the year round voter engagement, civic engagement, community collective building. Like, that has to be in place, having relationships with elected officials who are going to be willing, even if they are in the minority in their chamber, they're still willing to go on the record, to be present and to be bold and fearless in opposition of, what is absolutely, against our.
And I'm going to cut you off on Noah, though, but I am real curious. Is there sort of, in these legislative proposals, have you noticed like instances of, and I guess this will be a question for Representative when we get her on it at some point, have there been instances where proponents and critics of these bills have been able to find common ground, where they say, okay, hey, you know what? This is at its core, maybe this is an issue of just preventing, the potential for an election security lapse. So have you seen instances where maybe there's some sort of compromise on the bill? Maybe it's okay or it's acceptable to pass one or two of those bills.
Well, the problem is, right, like, so I appreciate the question. But the thing is, like, we can't take it at face value that this is actually like a genuine concern around election security, particularly when we have the Secretary of State, who has been hailed as a hero nationwide, saying on the record, this is like the most secure election allegedly that Georgia has ever held. Like, nationally, we've been told that our federal election, like the entire election, was the most secure that we've ever had, right? Coming after, reports of attempted hacks and infrastructure breaches after the 2016 election, right? So that's a really big deal. And so when we're looking at what's actually more secure, we are seeing instances when we're advocates, whether they're partisan or nonpartisan, are actually pointing out that some of the provisions are less secure than what we already have in place. So, for example, the idea of signature match, like they've been attacking signature match in terms of the absentee ballots. Signature match in recent years has been kind of a problem because there hadn't been the opportunity for people to cure if there's a signature issue. And people can have signature issues for tons of reasons, just with your age. And this generation that's coming up, now that's newly voting, and the ones that are getting ready to come, a lot of them don't even learn cursive, right? So what their signature, like what my son's signature looks like, I'm worried when we sign his ballot for the first time next year, what's going to happen with his signature, right? Because they just don't learn cursive really anymore. And so, but there are procedures already in place for making sure that we had like really low turnover in ballots because of signature issues, because of a consent decree and some other issues that were put, or some other procedures that were put in place between the 2018 election and this one. So signature matching is actually more secure from what advocates have been saying than they want to move to having people use their their state ID or their driver's license number. That is less secure because anyone can get access to the number itself and not necessarily be that person, if you're really worried about making sure only the person voting is the person actually voting, right? And so there have been instances like that where people have actually pointed out that what they're doing is more restrictive, and it's not even, it's less secure as well. And we've seen this conversation going back to 2019 with the new voting machines, which several Republicans who advocated for them turned around in 2020 and all of a sudden wanted to get rid of them. We just got a new election system, which is less secure than many alternatives, but it's what was pushed through our state legislature in 2019 ahead of the 2020 election. So we're seeing a very similar pattern this time around as well.
Scott, yeah, how do we prepare voters, constituents for this like new voting landscape? Well, one, I mean, is there an expectation that like most of those bills in the Pennsylvania state legislature will pass, but then you have a governor of Pennsylvania, Governor Tom Wolf, he doesn't show any indication of signing off on these bills, but if some of those bills do happen to slip through, how do Pennsylvania voters gear up for it? What's the mobilization framework look like to adapt to that new climate, that new environment?
That's a great question. And, when these folks seek to take away the options that we have to vote, especially options that were duly sort of passed as law in Pennsylvania on a bipartisan level, I think it really just serves to confuse voters even more than they already are facing the big lie, right? I think one of the most important things that we can do right now in terms of how we communicate with voters around this is a couple things. We want to lead with values. We want to talk about how freedom is important, how justice is important, how equality is important. We want to remind folks that we have been here fighting for this for a very long time, and organizers and communities of color have had to fight the hardest for the least access historically. And then, we want to highlight what we can deliver, right? Which are policies that help voters cast ballots. I think I really resonated with what Noah was saying. I think that we can look at our current voter suppression as with a direct line back to Jim Crow and right to work laws, right? How did right to work laws happen, after industrialization, folks that were probably anti-voters then and would certainly be anti-voters now, identified that union power was changing the political landscape, and a lot of people of color, and specifically Black employees, were able to lift themselves up to a better standard of living through union contracts and collective bargaining. And so what the bosses did was pit, the union folks against other union folks using racism, using white supremacy, saying that if these folks get a benefit, it's taking something away from you. Isn't that bad? Isn't that wrong? Don't you want to feed your family? And I think if we fast forward to 2020 and we see the exact same dynamic where the idea that there is this big lie out there, and I don't even want to repeat it, everyone knows what it is, and driving that home for years before the election even took place is essentially setting up the supporters for one party to be looking at voters of colors in major cities as taking something away from them. And I think that is the justification they're using to silence our votes, to silence our voices. And I think connecting not only our issues in the community, excuse me, but this sort of, countrywide effort to silence voters is really important in terms of giving folks the motivation to keep going, right? Because at the end of the day, what we really need to do is vote. And they're going to try to make it as hard as possible using racism and white supremacy. That's horrible. The way to push back is to just make sure that you get out there and cast that ballot if it's at all possible in your life. And I think that, the messaging is a critical part of that right now.
Hey, Representative, you and I have always talked about that civic literacy piece. This is a very complex web of bills that are being proposed, right? For all sorts of addressing all sorts of different aspects of the electoral process. It's just really confusing for voters and constituents to follow. And so what are representatives like you, what are legislators like you trying to do to educate the public about exactly what to prepare for or what to look at that they should call the legislature about if they have concerns about it?
Well, I mean, what I always try to do, irrespective of the issue, is to connect the dots for my neighbors and constituents, because they're not being, corporate media is not doing that. The corporations that claim to be supportive of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and all the folks who, thought changing Aunt Jemima on the brand is going to address racial justice, to not fall for the okie doke. So I try to do Facebook Live videos and talk from my office, talk from the street to my constituents, say, hey, this is what's really going on. And for the record, I mentioned kind of the duopoly that is something that people just accept, like, is the norm. It doesn't have to be. But we can't have a meaningful conversation about this without talking about campaign finance reform and how corporations dominate the legislative process, and towards that, dominate candidates and incumbents. So in Pennsylvania, State Representative Chris Rabb could take $1 billion check from Walmart, and that would be legal. You can't do that if you're running for Congress. But I know it's looking strange. There are no campaign finance restrictions. I could receive a Tesla from a lobbyist as long as I disclosed it. I could get a summer house from a lobbyist. As long as I disclosed it, it's not a bribe, it's not unethical, but yet it is unethical. That's Pennsylvania. And you're telling me those laws and those opportunities for malfeasance and corruption aren't going to influence the legislative process? Let me just tell you how. I'm just going to be real. When we as House Democrats caucus a bill, that means we review bills that are coming up in a legislative week. We say, well, what's the stakeholder analysis? Where are the unions on this? Where's the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce on this? Where's the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce on this? Where are the schools unions on this, et cetera, et cetera? We do this for all major bills, right? What about the voices that are not at the table? And why are we listening to the Chamber of Commerce? Why do we care so much? Well, because their members cut very large checks through major executives who have to do it with a personal check or through a PAC that they set up. Corporations create foundations. They also create political action committees, and they cut huge checks. And you're telling me that's not going to have an influence on the nature of things that are moved legislatively. And the last thing is, corporations are either mealy-mouthed, which is really, I think Noah mentioned that, how mealy-mouthed, or they're silent. But you know who's not silent is a bunch of organized consumers saying, yeah, we're not going to stand for this. But it only matters, to your point, Charles, is if they are civically literate and understand how we can pressure corporations that we don't connect to electoral politics oftentimes, who are in fact have their thumb on the scale of justice. And once we figure out that nexus, we will be much more powerful collectively. And that's work that happens in between election cycles, not during.
Let me bring on Representative Beaton Gwynn, who represents Georgia's 89th legislative district, if I understand it correctly. She's at B for Georgia, by the way, on social media. She just now tuned. She was joining us a little bit late, but I want to have a chance to bring her in on the conversation. Representative Gwynn, how are you doing? I hope all is well with you and your folks, your constituents down there. Just continuing to extend prayers and condolences to everyone down there in the Atlanta metro area. But thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to see my sister in progress from Georgia on here as well. I do. So it has been a few very overwhelming days, and I was talking to Fair Fight last night, and I said, you need to speed me up on what's going on with Georgia elections, because it changes every day. We're seeing these massive omnibus bills every single day, and because of the horrific and violent shooting that happened in Atlanta this week, I was unable to tune into the elections committee hearing yesterday. And so, yeah, but I do want to piggyback on the conversation about corporations. So the Metro Chamber, the Chamber of Commerce here in Atlanta, they are powerful lobbying entities. And every single year, what we see is Republican lawmakers really pushing through their agenda, which is typically centered around corporate tax breaks and also stopping any legislation that would support workers. And so we are a right to work state. We have very weak laws when it comes to protecting our workers. We're unable to do things like raise minimum wage because we have a preemption law on the book. We're unable to pass things like making it illegal to sexually harass in the workplace. And it is the chambers and the businesses that stop those pieces of legislation from moving forward every year. And so what we have is a situation where the chambers and the businesses are benefiting from the Georgia legislature, and they are choosing not to step up in any meaningful way as we are seeing these voter suppression laws get introduced in the legislature. And it leaves us in a very hard bargaining position as Democrats in the legislature, because we are the ones who are simultaneously working to increase protections for workers, to push for livable wages for workers, and it is the antithesis of their agenda. And so they're not going to listen to us in the same way. They're not going to support us as candidates in the same way. And so it complicates the dynamic between Democratic lawmakers who are trying to fight against voter suppression, because quite frankly, we aren't the ones pushing forward these massive tax breaks. But it always comes at the expense of our citizens. It comes at the expense of our voters. And even when we are talking about things like massive tax breaks and corporate tax dollars, that comes at the expense of our citizens. And so it is a very challenging position to be in the minority party here, and the type of power that corporations have and the fact that they are not levying their power to help us with these voter suppression bills leads me to believe that they are benefiting from the very same people who are pushing the voter suppression bills. So I think that the activating our consumers and activating our workers, the people that work for these corporations, allow them to be so prosperous, is certainly important, because they will understand what the consequences are when consumers choose to boycott their businesses and call them out for their lack of leadership on this issue.
I see Representative Tu. I'll give you a little bit more time, Representative Gwen, because I'm real curious to kind of get your thoughts. I've been asking, I'm sort of starting to shift the discussion towards, kind of next steps, right? And we did have someone ask about that, like, well, we're going to have a new landscape, particularly in a state like Georgia. That's what we're anticipating. So I'm seeing like sort of two tracks of activities. One is, the advocacy and mobilization around, kind of sparking awareness around these types of bills and seeing if there are ways to stop them through like that consumer advocacy you talked about. So that's one track. But the other track is anticipating and just expecting that the bills are going to pass. They will become law. And so your thoughts, Representative, on how you help the electorate, how you help voters, citizens of Georgia adapt to that new climate?
I think we're used to adapting to voter suppression laws in Georgia, so it's not new. Every single year that I've served in the General Assembly, we see some sort of effort to restrict the right to vote. Some of those efforts have been overturned through litigation, so we know that litigation will certainly be a tool. But as a minority party in the state of Georgia, we have always understood it is harder for our voters to vote, and we organize 365 days a year because of that very same fact. And our organizing game is different, right? So we see organizers across the state of Georgia really think about our communities and what the needs are. And we were really successful in that. And that is part of the reason why those two guys behind me won their elections and why the president won in Georgia, because we have always organized as if we were running behind. We have always organized as if we knew it would be harder, that voters would be suppressed, and they are suppressed. And we have always understood that our margin had to be much greater and our turnout had to be much greater under those circumstances. So it is continuing to educate voters on the constant change of rules. An example is, I remember last year we had a very intensive debate around this idea. I put an amendment on the table and I said, my amendment is to require local election boards to text or call voters if there's a precinct consolidation or change. And we know that that happens a lot, especially in metro counties where there are consolidations and closures. And Republicans fought me tooth and nail on that amendment because they don't want voters to know. And, they brought up cost. They brought up, well, the elections boards already send a letter to folks in the mail. I'm like, well, that can easily get lost. And when we campaign as candidates, we don't send out one piece of mail. We send out 7, we make calls, we text message, we knock on doors. And so, we know that we are met with those challenges because they just don't want voters to vote. But I think that we have done a tremendous job, souls to the polls. I think there was I think Black Voters Matter did a really creative thing around collards, and just being culturally relevant to people. I thought that was brilliant. Advancing Justice has done a lot of in-language outreach, which we continue to need to do, using in-language canvassers, using in-language phone banking, and then having our hotline, our voter protection hotline, which has been instrumental in fielding calls from voters who are confused about the laws and had trouble accessing absentee ballots and all these other things. But we expanded that to include 7 different languages. And then a massive ballot curing program where we were going door to door and helping people fix their ballots when they were rejected for signature mismatch or lack of signatures. So I imagine that we will adapt to whatever changes are going to happen. So in the instance of the voter ID requirement for absentee ballot voting, that will require us to make sure that people are equipped with the technology to be able to make a copy of their photo ID, or educating voters on early voting and making sure that they can show up in person. I mean, we saw the way that we adapted in the pandemic. Democrats traditionally haven't voted by mail. We just have not. From 2005, when Republicans passed no excuse absentee ballot voting, up until 2019, they were the ones who primarily used vote by mail, not us. Obviously, they want to attack vote by mail now because we were creative in mobilizing our voters through vote by mail. So I'm confident that we will adapt to whatever is passed. It will be hard. We will suppress voters, and it shouldn't always be the case where we are having to adapt and be creative and work harder and work smarter. But that's the reality. We do work harder and we do work smarter, and that's why we want.
I'm real curious to explore this element of it too. I know I'll go back to you, and then Scott, I'd like you to chime in on it as well. I think we might still have Representative Rapp. He might be on the phone at this point. Okay, so how do you also convince those other pockets of voters who are under the impression, right, that that voter suppression is the way for them to go? They're not seeing it as a voter suppression or voting rights issue. They're seeing it as an election security issue. But at the end of the day, you restrict, or you feel as if maybe you're restricting the voting franchise or access to voting for one population of or group of people. But what ends up happening is it influences and impacts everyone. So I'm wondering is if let me start with you on that, like especially in a state like Georgia, where there's like obviously some clear ideological, racial, political divides. I mean, is there an opportunity there to kind of get everyone on the same page, all voters on the same page about like how potentially threatening these laws are to everyone's right to vote?
Unfortunately, you're not going to ever get consensus from absolutely everyone on anything, and any parents who is trying to figure out what to do for dinner can tell you that one. But but just thinking about just the work, that folks like, Representative B. Wynn and several of the movement leaders and organizers that we have all over the state, right? And an example that she gave about the pandemic, that's a prime example of in the middle of the pandemic last year, when we had, and we're still in the pandemic, but in the middle of the pandemic last year, when we were seeing areas like Albany, Georgia, down in Daughtry County, which is one of the hardest hit areas, not just in Georgia, but nationwide. And we were talking about providing, absentee ballots to every eligible voter in the state. We still had sharp opposition and people like not necessarily happy that the Secretary of State was mailing out absentee ballot applications to all eligible voters to make it easier in the middle of a pandemic that was literally taking people's lives and neighbors away from them, right? So we've already seen in these really like clear instances where it should be a no-brainer, there shouldn't be any dissent, that we have seen, fighting in opposition to just making it easier for people who are eligible to access the franchise, right? The other thing is, unfortunately, over the last several years in particular, because some of this stuff predates, Donald Trump specifically, when we talk about the peppering the field and the fear of voter fraud. Voter fraud is not a real concern, but it's a real fear that a lot of people have because they have been conditioned to believe that those people over there are going to try to take something from them. We saw that the result of that, not just on January 6th in DC, but we even had a small contingent of folks who walked through the Georgia Capitol looking for the Secretary of State and other elected officials. So we do, unfortunately, have people who believe, unfortunately, all this disinformation that has been fed to them about the system of election, about what people are doing. And sadly, even our elected officials here, like our Secretary of State and one of his staffers, Gabe Sterling, they feed into some of that by claiming that organizations like Fair Fight are spreading disinformation by actively, while they're doing some things that are right, they still feed into some of the overall fear. Like we have a site, a section of the Secretary of State site that's there for people to report voter fraud, which is so, for that to be a focus. I mean, he launched the criminal voter fraud absentee fraud task force last year, instead of launching something to help unifying all 159 counties within the state to make sure they are on the same page. We do not see the state investing in our counties to make sure all the counties are on the same page and have the resources they need to effectively administer our elections. But we do see this rush to make sure that people don't have the same access equally everywhere. Yeah. And so unfortunately, we have a segment of the population that believes that this is the right thing and this is being done this has to be done for a reason. But as we have seen people have these conversations. We have seen some people, have to understand and begin to move on some issues. And so I think, like, Representative Wynn was saying, we continue to have the conversations, we continue to do the coverage, we continue to educate, explore, and expand with people, and folks will choose to believe maybe a new truth and let go of what they've been told.
Yeah, exactly. So you see where I'm headed with that, because I feel like, at the very core of this conversation is about the foundation of democracy, right? You don't have a democracy without voting and without like the equal representation that like results from that voting. I mean, it's just like, why do it if there's no voting, or if there's like limited access to a right to vote, or if there are restrictions on it? And so I'm just trying to figure out, like, does that present an opportunity here where, because so much of this discussion about voter suppression, voting rights, and some people are calling it election reform, right? I mean, so much of it is, unfortunately, it's being framed in terms of like, just partisan conflicts and tensions, and just, is there an opportunity there to kind of like also persuade folks who feeling like, oh, this doesn't affect me, this is not my battle. Well, no, it is, because if we don't have voting, or if we have like very limited voting, then everything sort of falls apart for you. Like, we don't have a functioning democracy. And so, Scott, you understand where I'm headed with that? Like, I'm figuring out, like, is there kind of that that really nonpartisan, or less partisan tinged conversation to kind of let people know that, hey, it's in your best interest too, to ensure that there are as few restrictions. Actually, literally, in my mind, I'm just thinking there shouldn't be any restrictions at all when we're talking about voting. This should be a very simple thing to do, a very simple exercise, but apparently it's not. But go ahead, Scott.
Oh, absolutely. And, I want to talk about a little bit of polling that our partner, or the organization that we're a part of, the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, as well as the Voting Rights Lab, put together, that I think kind of paints a picture of the landscape we're really in, right? I think the first point is that this is all total BS, right? This election destruction, this suppression, it's the same tactic and the same playbook that anti-voters use, even in the US Congress, where instead of talking about the values that we hold around elections, around freedom, equality, integrity, they want to narrow the conversation to the thinnest possible slice of issues and say, well, this is about fraud. That's all it's about. We're not talking about any voting. We're not talking about any, disenfranchisement. Just this teeny little thing, and they're leaving out the fact that when they do that, they're taking freedom away from Americans. They're taking this idea that our elections have integrity and are secure, and they're working to take our freedoms away, right? And so we know that of the battleground states in the 2020 election, support for early voting spans demographic, partisan, and regional lines. 70% of all voters support early voting, just bar none. That's it. There's no, sort of other number there. Democratic leaning voters tend to support it a little more. Republican leaning voters tend to support it a little less. But overall, 7 in 10 people support this stuff and know that it's a good option for them. Absentee balloting, 74% support. No excuse balloting, 70% support, right? And so they are constructing this straw man to narrow the conversation to, well, we just care about your community and the security around the ballot. And so I think our job is to take that narrative away from them by talking about how voting is about freedom, it's about equality, it's about integrity, connecting these values. And, I think the other piece is that it becomes really difficult to sort of prove that a thing doesn't exist, right? And so that's like the way that anti-voters want to position themselves. And, we know that elections are secure. We know that security is an important part of how we run elections. And when we center our values, center freedom, and frame these voter destruction efforts as silencing our voices, I think
Right.
we're able to start effectively pushing back on some of these frames.
Yeah.
And, the other thing I'll sort of posit is, I started organizing in Philadelphia, knocking on doors around the old Sunoco refinery down in South and Southwest Philadelphia, helped with the Community Labor Refinery Committee and working with labor and community and the refinery itself. And, as I started to learn how to organize, they taught me that one effective way to do it is to agitate, educate, organize, right? And so part of the dynamic I'm sort of considering here is that anti-voters just agitated everyone in the whole country around these election issues. And I think people's ears pricked up a little bit. I think we've got some huge damaging pieces of this where people don't believe in elections as much
Right.
anymore. And at the same time, crisis sometimes breeds opportunity. And I think we need to really get out there and connect these values to voters and then let them know that, hey, contact your representative, contact your community, but also the most powerful thing you can do to make sure that people in your state know that voting is important is to vote.
And we have about thanks, Scott. We have about a half hour more of this conversation. I'm going to open it up for anyone who's listening now who has questions, any comments. You can leave that in the Zoom group chat. You can do that now. Definitely, we got a couple of questions that have already been posed. So if anyone's in the audience has any sort of questions or feedback or any perspective they'd like to offer in this conversation, we welcome it. You can do that right now in our voting rights threat assessment conversation here on this movement summit. We are now in the movement summit series. We transitioned from the micro summits of 2020 into our movement summits. This is being presented to you by the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference's Council on Communities of Color, of which I'm a senior fellow. My name is Charles Ellison. You can reach me at Ellison Report on Twitter.com. And still, Representative Rabb and also Representative Nguyen, I'd like for you all to chime in on, this is a question from someone who was listening in. How does the Hr1 John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and Representative Nguyen, I'm sure you were probably talking with, that's one subject that came up when you were talking with Senator Warnock and Ossoff at a certain juncture, but how does that factor into this conversation? What sort of support are you looking for or hoping for if Hr1 were to pass? Representative Rabb, I'll start with you and then Representative Nguyen.
We need all the help we can get, right? So, those of us who are in embattled states, it's important to get that reinforcement from the feds to protect our very fragile participatory democracy. So it's essential. And when we talk about the kind of infrastructure of what worked in Georgia, what worked in Pennsylvania, basically our city commissioners, the folks who manage the elections in the largest county, the most populous county of 67 in our state, basically said, we will spend however much money, even if we don't have it in our budget, to ensure that everyone has access to vote based on state law. And they shouldn't be in that position where they basically have to write get a loan that's been unsecured. But they knew what they needed to do to get it done. And the whole world was watching Philadelphia, and we came through, but we cannot sustain that type of apparatus going forward without the proper funding. So we hope to get funding from the feds, but we also have to get funding on the state and local level, because whatever it is that we seek to do, we have to have the resources to implement it effectively. So there's a lot of things that exist in law that where there's no compliance, where there's no follow-up, where there's no meaningful implementation, no resources to make it happen. And politicians can get away with saying, hey, I passed this bill into law, or we have this on the books. It doesn't matter if it's not enforceable. So getting those protections from the federal level is helpful. We need those resources as well. But we also need the larger kind of support in terms of the narrative that Scott laid out so effectively. Those narratives are important. And it also comes back to what we always talk about, Charles, is civic literacy and connecting the dots between both consumer power, right? And also the institutions themselves that produce the legislation. I just want to give one quick example if I can, because this is not nearly as partisan as people think. Now, we can say that the promoters of the worst voter suppression bills are all Republicans. That's true. But if you also look at Utah, they're kind of quiet because they have mail-in only voting there for how many years, Scott? I don't know, a long time. And no one's talking about voter fraud. Why? They don't have any black and brown folk in enough masses to have a meaningful impact on their power. So they don't have to talk about it. And they can embrace something that works without removing them from power.
Right.
As soon as this proves
I think
to be
both
bad
Utah
for the
and
Democratic
Oregon, I
Party, it'll
think
change.
they've had mail-in balloting kind of universal. I think that's been going on for over a decade now, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely, not the only state, but it's a bright red state. And if a bright red state has used it for a long time, it works for them. They never talk about voter fraud. How is it that it's an issue in everywhere else, right? So that shows you the real politics behind this, right? It's really not about the options, because if you're a conservative, you're supposed to like the competitive marketplace and choices, right? And self-reliance. I want to do it my way. I don't want to be part of the nanny state. So if I wanted to vote at home, then I should vote at home. If I want to vote at the polls, I should do that. But when it comes to voting, we have a different narrative in the states where it matters, where the power dynamic is different. They don't have to worry about these issues in Utah presently.
Yeah, Representative Nguyen, if you could, the HR1, how that might help, or the types of resources, kind of follow up on what Representative Rabb is saying here, if that's helpful. And I know that Pennsylvania and Georgia, two very different states, right? And you all are dealing with, on some levels, you're dealing with a similar set of circumstances, but then you're also dealing with very unique, very different sets of circumstances. But I'd like to get your thoughts on like that type of support, whether or not HR1 can provide that type of support, or the type of national, federal level support that you could receive to help bolster voting rights.
Oh, absolutely. We need HR1 like 20 years ago. So there's urgency in seeing Congress pass that. And certainly both Senator Warnock and Ossoff understand the urgency of what that looks like. HR1 contains a lot of provisions that we as Democrats have been trying to pass through the state legislature. Things like being able to register on the day of the election and being able to vote and vote on the day of the election if you aren't previously registered. It also codifies things like secure drop boxes, which have been on the chopping block this year at the legislature. And it deals with independent redistricting. And we know we are going to be going through a redistricting process here in Georgia. And Republicans have the power to draw the maps. And we know that we will see more gerrymandering. How much gerrymandering they can get away with, we don't know what that's going to look like yet. But certainly they will continue that tradition of drawing these very partisan maps so that they can maintain control. But one thing that is most important in HR1 is restoring that pre-clearance provision. The pre-clearance provision that was previously in the Federal Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Supreme Court. And that really unleashed a lot of states, especially southern states, who have continually attacked voting rights since that pre-clearance provision was taken out of the Federal Voting Rights Act. So, I mean, it is critical. And I will say this, there's probably some misunderstanding around how it would even work. The Federal Voting Rights Act would obviously pertain to any federal elections, but during our almost every major election, independently of municipal cycles, it would apply to those state level races as well. If you have a federal candidate at the top and there are state level candidates encompassed in that, those rules would apply to those elections. So for example, next year in 2022, when we have statewide elections, when I hope that we are going to elect Stacey Abrams, if she so chooses to run for governor, we will also have Reverend Warnock's election at the top of that ticket. So passing HR1 would protect us in those circumstances. So it is urgent, it is needed. We need to end that filibuster so we can get this done, because if we can't get this done, it will change the trajectory of our country, and it will have lasting consequences, and it will impact us, and it will, I mean, we will see irreparable damage.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing too is that back to both of you, Representative Gwynn, Representative Rapp, are you kind of talking with other states? You know, because this is the majority of states that are going through this, right? But just going back to something you were saying earlier, Representative Rapp, about states like Utah, and Scott also left the text in the Zoom group chat about Oregon. I think there are a couple of other states who might believe it. Colorado also comes to mind. But are you talking to other states? Are there, we had one listener saying, are there recommendations for state governments as well to assist with HR1? So, I mean, one, coordinating with other states, who are in similar situations, maybe kind of finding some collective power around this issue. And then two, how can you get those state governments to help kind of push the Congress to get this passed? Or Representative Rabb?
So the key components of HR1, whether it's early voting, streamlining voter registration, restoring the Voting Rights Act, which is applicable to X number of states, Pennsylvania not being one of them, citizen-funded elections, that's on the federal level. So all of these things are great and could have a huge impact in states across the union, but it does require that infrastructure. In terms of Pennsylvania, any voter suppression bill will be vetoed by our Democratic governor, and that veto will be sustained because you need a 2/3 vote to override it, and Republicans don't have that. So we have, we have some level of protection here in Pennsylvania. We also have a very enlightened state Supreme Court that wouldn't allow these things to happen if they were indeed ruled unconstitutional. But other states, state legislators talk a lot between states, but depending on the apparatus of how your state operates may mean that talking to a neighboring state is not as meaningful as talking to a state clear across the country based on how the institutions run. And just as an example, and I don't know how it works in Georgia, but if you want to be the head of the state government committee or any standing committee, the only factor that matters, or the first factor that matters, is seniority, not experience, not knowledge, not formal education, not intelligence, work ethic, nothing. The second most important factor to determine if you get to be a chair of a committee that rules over all elections things is the first letter of your last name. So if your last name is Zabel and you're coming from a big incoming class, you will never be a committee chair, just based on the rules. And as a result, as of until last year, there were no women who were committee chairs on the Democratic side. And that's because of seniority and generations of patriarchy and sexism that made it harder for women candidates to be considered as viable as lesser male candidates. We have to understand how these institutions function and our place in it in our respective states, because what may work in Georgia may not work in Pennsylvania. But when we find out what does work in states where we have similar institutions and similar kind of operations around our legislature, we have more power.
Yeah, Representative Gwynn, as far as I really would love to get your perspective on other states, other legislators that you're talking to.
So, I don't know that if there's a coordinated effort for state leaders to talk to each other, but I do know that we oftentimes look at other states so that we have an understanding of what their policies are and what's working for them. And we have certainly looked at states who have used primarily mail-in ballot models and looked at some of the provisions there to try and implement them here in Georgia. Also looking at other states who do use a primarily mail-in ballot model and finding out whether or not there are any cases in which there was a prevalence of voter fraud. The answer is no. The answer is no. And those statistics are very telling and also it is just incredibly low. I think, every study that I've read from, investigations not specific to this election, but, ones that have been happening for many years, it's a handful. It's literally like 10 out of, 1 million votes or something. And so we certainly rely on other states for that. I would say that I do have conversations with lawmakers in different states, including Arizona, including Michigan, just from the network of my colleagues that I've come to know through other avenues. And one of the things that we have been talking about was the sham Rudy Giuliani hearings that took place both in Michigan, that took place in Georgia. And I remember specifically talking to one of my friends, a state rep in Michigan, and I said, and he really called out Giuliani in that hearing, and it was before the ones that took place in Georgia. And I said, oh man, I wish he was coming before my committee so I can say the same thing that you just said to him. And it turned out he did come before my committee, but it was extremely stressful. And I will say that the colleagues that my friends that I have in the state ledge in Arizona, in Virginia, in other states were really helpful in providing resources for me to really parse through that voter list that the alleged expert witness used in the lawsuit they filed against our Secretary of State to try to overturn the election. There were thousands of voters' names on there. There were exhibits that suggested somebody voted in 2 states, both in Georgia and both in Virginia. And we were able to use collectively our resources and databases from our Secretary of State and their states to determine that those were not, in fact, the same people. And so they were really helpful in, being able to provide those resources. And we continue to talk and offer each other support because, Arizona has been going through similar challenges as we have. And we know that these are unfounded accusations. We know that these lawsuits were completely sham, and there's just been no evidence, but we're fighting against the same thing.
I'd have to agree with you too on one point, Representative. Sometimes it baffles me. There are really no empirical studies that show voter fraud is a problem. And when I have asked those proponents of some of this type of legislation, like, well, do you have any studies or empirical data suggesting voter fraud is a problem? That question is typically avoided. I see lots of studies all the time on voter suppression. So that it's just one kind of baffling sort of ripple to the conversation. Also, we have a representative from New Hampshire, Sherry Dutzian. Representative Dutz, really appreciate you joining us and being with us today. And she was saying how voter suppression is not just about people of color. In New Hampshire, we have lots of voter suppression bills this term. It's the far right wanting to make sure they can hold on to power. We are a purple state, and she was saying how Pennsylvania is lucky. New Hampshire government is all Republican, including the Supreme Court. We have no way to stop these bills at this point. And, so just want to sort of wrap this conversation, get some final thoughts. Anoa, in terms of the national mobilization effort, this is a really alarming situation that we're in. 250 plus bills in 43 different states, all kind of honed in on restricting voter access. It's a very alarming situation. I don't think like pop culture, the zeitgeist it's really sunk in that this is happening right now in real time. What's that national mobilization effort like, right? I mean, like where's kind of the is there a feeling that there's like a swell of an army of activists and lawyers and voting rights proponents who are really kind of coming together? And I feel like there's like different efforts in different states, but things seem kind of fractured. I don't know, but that's just sort of my impression from here.
I think there's a couple different things. I know Scott can definitely talk to this, you know, in terms of the work that All Voting is Local does, along with the Lawyers Committee. I mean, like a lot of us have the same exact lawyers involved in all of these different states, right? Like, so the Lawyers Committee, the Advancement Project, like a lot of us have the same people who handle, you know, these challenges nationally, like helping in terms of individual state issues, right? So I think also to, you know, just I think what the representative was saying earlier about how just states just differ so much, you can't necessarily have a one unified strategy, because while we do have multiple different bills in multiple different places, they're in different stages. There are different, like, you know, internal politics at play in each state. But in terms of what we're seeing, the movement around Hr1, and really seeing a concerted effort in moving that forward, there does seem to be a lot of movement around several different pieces in terms of how does Hr1 move successfully through the Senate, whether that is through folks who are advocating around abolishing the filibuster or what other procedural mechanisms can be done. So I think part of the challenges is that there are so many moving pieces and it's a very complex issue. So you do see people prioritizing this as a part of advocacy. It might not be getting the same media attention outside of spaces that you and I create, but it's definitely work that has been ongoing and something I think people really who have not already been in that year-round civic engagement space, as you know, Rep. Rab and Scott said earlier, people are understanding how this is a very constant, ongoing, you know, effort, and presence is definitely needed.
Yeah, because it's you know, like between this 250 plus bills in 43 states, what you all are dealing with on the ground in places like Pennsylvania, Georgia, the battle to pass Hr1, and we didn't even mention, but that's also looming, Supreme Court deliberation over the cases out of Arizona regarding Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. You know, that we're probably looking at, you know, perhaps like, you know, the Voting Rights Act all but being destroyed. And so I just feel like voting rights should be like the trend topic every day on Twitter, and it's not. But that's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation. I'm actually going to go ahead and wrap this, let everyone go and kind of get the rest of their Friday to them. Representative Gwen, did you want to add one more point?
I did want to add something. You know, I think the NBA has done a tremendous job of uplifting voter suppression, voting rights, and mobilizing voters and racial justice as a whole. And they were really instrumental in making sure we had State Farm Arena for a voting location. And many voters who voted at State Farm Arena loved their experience. And they've continued to message around those things. And, you know, even now in the wake of this brutal and violent shooting, they have been outspoken against hate crimes against the AAPI community. And so I do think we need to continue to think creatively about ways to engage people, because we know that obviously lawmakers are going to be entrenched in this. But when you think about people who are just trying to get through the day, who go to work, have kids, maybe you're not going to be politically plugged in a non-election year, it is hard to understand the gravity of what is happening. But I will say they've done a tremendous job. And if we can continue to think about ways in which we can be creative about messaging and really engage people where they are, because not everyone is going to want to go to a town hall or go to a committee meeting at the legislature or read a news article. But if you're at home watching basketball, and you see some of the messaging around that, I think that really resonates with people. And so one of the things that I do love about the organizing community is that it does take away, organizers understand the way that communities operate and how people live their lives day to day. And they're really creative about making sure we center people and not center the structures that we have in place around politics, which is really exclusionary and inaccessible for most people. So I just wanted to uplift that and think about, you know, what are some other orgs who have that same powerful ability to message to people without asking people to have to come to us.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks so much, Representative Nguyen. Representative Bean Nguyen, representing the 89th Legislative District in the state of Georgia. She's in the Georgia House of Representatives. Really appreciate your time, Representative. Thanks so much. Also, Anoa Shanga, Atlanta-based electoral justice investigative journalist, also lawyer, and written for a number of publications at The Way with Anoa. To learn more about her, really appreciate you, Anoa, as always. Scott Seaboard, All Voting is Local Pennsylvania State Director, and always good to see you as well. I'm Charles Ellison. You've been joining us for our Movement Summit on voting rights and what's happening in the various states. This is being recorded and it will be on other platforms, including the bnote.com, and broadcasted very soon on WURD radio and some other outlets as well. You will be able to find that on social media at #Movement Summit very shortly. And want to thank Debbie Ann Page, Director of the Council on Communities of Color at the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, doing a fantastic job. That's who made this possible. This is a production. Movement Summits are a production of the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. We have many coming up. Please stay tuned. Watch #Movement Summit, csg-erc.org for more information there, and also the bnote.com. All right, everyone, have a great weekend. Thanks for everyone's time, and we'll see you soon. Be safe out there. Take care. Thanks, everyone.